Now, following a spate of looting and unrest which has continued throughout the week, police confirming that 2 men killed yesterday in Brixton and Sophiatown were South African, while the security guard killed in Hillbrow on Monday was a Zimbabwean woman. Now, it also comes as tonight authorities confirming the discovery of 2 charred bodies in Alexander, north of Johannesburg. Now, apart from the loss of life, many have seen their businesses and their belongings be completely destroyed. So let's then try and unpack part of what may be driving this violence and have a progressive and constructive conversation about how we come up with solutions to what we're currently experiencing. From Cape Town, I'm joined by Ivan Katsere. In studio with me, Sarah Motha, she's with the Foundation for Human Rights, and Janet Munakwane, who is with the Africa Diaspora Workers Network. Let me thank you all for your time tonight. Perhaps let's begin with the basics. How do you describe what we're seeing in South Africa right now? I'll begin with you, Mamsera.
In the past few days and over the past months and certainly the past years since 2008, we have seen a spate of violence, mainly directed to migrants or refugees and asylum seekers in South Africa. It has escalated, if you're asking directly what we have seen. This is accompanied by a loading of xenophobic or anti-migration messages from various voices who are political voices and are influential in the public space. Now, with the prevailing socioeconomic conditions, not only being the one, but you're dealing with a country that intergenerationally has been exposed to violence, all form of violence, political violence in the past, and currently the socioeconomic conditions, which I can briefly describe as inequality. The socioeconomic inequality continues to perpetuate the level of psychological violence, internalized forms of violence to the broader majority of South Africans.
Is what we're witnessing xenophobic violence? If yes, why? And if not, why?
As I just said, the narrative is that migrants, there's few myths, and one of the going around myth is that migrants are taking jobs in South Africa, and it continues to be rubber-stamped in the minds of many South Africans. And then that fuels the stereotypes around the views and the actions that are being taken on the ground. So with such messages being popularized, then definitely it creates a certain stereotype, including the issues of drugs, which quite often are pointed to one direction, not mentioning the corrupt police that collude with any other criminal elements related to drug sales and mulling.
Janet, how would you describe the violence that we're seeing?
Let me begin by greeting the viewers and also to convey my heartfelt condolences to those who have lost their lives in these xenophobic attacks, and also, of course, the femicide. It's unfortunate that we are actually meeting in this room tonight under these very gloomy circumstances where we have lost lives, 2 lives. Of course, you alluded earlier that there's security guard who is a lady who was also affected recently in Hillbrow in these xenophobic attacks. Well, I think for me, xenophobia, we live it almost every day in different forms. There is what we call structural xenophobia, that which makes it impossible for migrants themselves to get documented, because all the issues, there are a whole range of issues, where we have the state-crafted policies and laws that actually select who should enter South Africa, who is wanted and who is not wanted. Why do I say this? The attacks that you see and we witness on a daily basis, they normally happen in those vulnerable sectors. Like, for instance, for many months, we've been struggling with the issue of truck drivers. There's all this, rhetoric around foreign drivers are coming here to steal our jobs. Then I touch on what Sarah has just mentioned, the inequalities, of course, that those who are vulnerable, working in vulnerable sectors, they can only find affordable places to stay, obviously, in the townships, where they have to mingle every day with their colleagues who are also suffering in the same way as themselves. And the moment they see them in South Africa, they have this misconceptions that perhaps they're doing better, or because they have a job, of which the job is not that lucrative, but they're just trying to wake up early in the morning to ensure that at least they have something to put on the table.
Sure.
Sure.
Let me take this conversation then to Ivan, who's joining us in Pretoria. Ivan, good evening. And I'll pose the same question to you then. Government speaks of criminality, but President Cyril Ramaphosa takes it a step further and says he condemns then any strains of xenophobia and attacks that may be fueled by xenophobia. But there seems to be this lurking question around the nature of violence that we're dealing with here. So how would you describe it?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. And with regards to describing the type of violence that we are experiencing currently, I would like to describe it as a manifestation of all the deep-seated frustration that we have seen in recent years. I would also like to support the other guest who went on to say that xenophobia is not just a moment, but it is a daily reality, both for the immigrants who are facing it, and also for the South Africans specifically who are living the daily realities of almost an oppressed life. What I mean by this is that it seems as if in South Africa, if I can put it this way, racism in both as a structure and also racialization in the form of attitudes has been perfected, in the sense that blackness and anything that represents blackness is hated. And through the frustrations that South Africans probably have, that come through the challenges of the hardships that we are facing in South Africa, the release that they have is this moment that comes and is defined as xenophobia. But I'd like to view it and describe it as a manifestation of the hate and oppression of whatever is black or defined as black or African, that is disposed in the wrong way.
Let's talk a little bit about something that you've touched on, which is appreciating what the lived experience then of South Africans is, and especially when you see the responses that people have to how officials are reacting to this violence. Some people say, well, we completely support a heavy-handed approach and rhetoric, which Sarah was talking about, that says, lock people up and lock as many of them up as possible. But of course, that in itself can be quite dangerous.
Yeah, I'd like to go on and say locking people up might be a band-aid to the problem. We are not really addressing the problem that is currently at hand, which is what actually informs xenophobia, xenophobia for lack of a better word, but I would like to call it Aphrophobia. What actually informs it are all the narratives that are going around of how we view immigrants in comparison to tourists, for example, how we problematize foreigners who are coming from African countries and welcome tourists who are coming from European countries, for example. I think the problem started a long time ago, and in appreciating the experiences of South Africans, I think it is one thing to have a nation where specifically blacks are still oppressed in a sense, and we continue to see these demarcations of haves and have-nots, and they are really drawn with racial guidelines. That's why there is an appreciation of these experiences, especially of black South Africans who are still, in a sense, oppressed. And this is what I think, in collaboration with the discourses that go around, if you pair the two together, this is what leads to moments that are defined as xenophobic moments, which are everyday experiences, which blow up in moments of violence like this one.
Sarah, one of the things that becomes also a dangerous one is when we look at how the interpretation of what we're seeing right now being reduced to simply one thing, because multiple studies have told us that it is a complex issue and compounded really by a multitude of factors, among them existing stereotypes and myths, but notwithstanding those alone.
Certainly. If you might have heard earlier, I did mention the political violent history that most South Africans have carried to the present. And then secondly, I mentioned the social issues and the economic issues. So this is just an abbreviation of the root causes. So if you break it down, what do we mean by socio-economic issues? We're meaning issues of, survival, food daily, shelter daily, work, which all these healthcare, which all these are rights, a clean and healthy environment, freedom of expression, association, the right to be heard. Most cases, as Ivan has said, while we have had the democracy and the constitution, people don't get to feel that they are being heard when they are raising their concerns about their social, which water and sanitation. I mean, people are still using a bucket system. 20 households in informal settlements are sharing one singular sanitation facility. What kind of conditions are you exposing people to? And when it's time for voting, you go out and promise all these lists of, so a holistic, as you rightly say, it's not one. Due to time, we may not, but it's a multi-sectoral factor causing this scourge, and it cannot be only one.
Sure, and I'll give you an opportunity to also respond after this short break. You're live on News at Prime. We'll continue our conversation in a moment. Do stay with us. A quick recap of your top stories tonight. 2 charred bodies found in Alexandra. Police say the deaths may be linked to the recent violence in the township. They're now investigating. Meanwhile, in the mother city, stun grenades, water cannons and arrests in Cape Town as protesters outside the World Economic Forum demand action against gender-based violence. Our Pope Francis has touched ground in Maputo in Mozambique. He's on a historic visit as part of his 3-nation Africa tour. And in your sport, TS Galaxy expressed concern about traveling into the rest of the continent after attacks on foreign-owned shops. But we'll continue our conversation then. We're talking about what may be driving the violence that we're seeing and understanding really the nuances, the societal nuances that contribute to part of the scenes that we've watched play themselves out in the last couple of days. Ivan Katsere joins us from our Cape Town studio, Sarah Motha from the Foundation for Human Rights, and Janet Munakwane is a migrant labor expert and activist. She's with the Africa Diaspora Workers Network. I think let me pick up then with you, Janet. You spoke about how xenophobia is a lived experience for many migrants in the country. How much of it is based on prejudice? whether seen or unseen by South Africans, knowingly or unknowingly, acting or meting it out on immigrants?
Oh, thanks, Cathy. I guess, like, there is subtle xenophobia, of course, that's not, like, out there, like I've mentioned earlier, that is around the policies, immigration policies, and the legislation that migrants themselves have no control of. Then, of course, there are those attacks. Sometimes it's manifested, obviously, in the form of violence, or even perhaps psychologically, like people just call somebody kwere kwere, or you don't tell me what to do because you are a foreigner. You can't really. But unfortunately, migrants, while they try to integrate, sometimes they feel alienated, like in certain spaces where they feel like they can contribute towards perhaps issues of gender-based violence. But you'd find that some of them are already neglected when they air out their views. For instance, we have a fellow colleague who is also an activist who faced gender-based violence in the form of rape, but nothing really was done in terms of perhaps mobilizing support to say, no, this needs to be denounced. Like, for instance, when she had to go and seek medical health, medical care in the hospitals, unfortunately, she was denied the very same treatment that a local could actually access. So those are some of the examples. We have recently, 3 weeks away, a woman from Zimbabwe who was forced to give birth while standing. Yes, of course, we might say it's not something that happened on the street like what we are witnessing today, but that's part of what I'm trying to categorize as structural xenophobia, of which obviously, if a migrant begins to complain about it, it will be like dubbed as, no, but also South Africans face the same conditions in hospital.
Sure.
But of course, what people tend to ignore is the fact that if it happens, the inequalities, the atrocities, poor treatment of an ordinary, perhaps sick person happens even for a South African. What more about a migrant who would actually requested perhaps to produce exorbitant, perhaps paperwork, or meet certain particular conditions for them to be able to deliver in a public hospital?
Sure.
So those are some of the ways in which xenophobia manifests itself in our daily, lives. But also to touch on the issues of perhaps racism itself. Like, if I'm black, obviously people would want to know, Jeanette is from outside. Where exactly does she come from? But if it's a white person or somebody with another pigment, obviously nobody would really care to bother to ask, to say, oh, okay, so you're speaking this in English. Why are you speaking to me in English? Don't you understand the locals? Simply because I'm black, I have to speak the local languages, the vernacular languages. Sure. Yet, if you take somebody from the Eastern Cape, they might not be able to articulate Venda from Limpopo. So those are some of the ways in which...
I'm going to interject you there and bring Ivan back into this conversation. Ivan, I wonder then what your take is in terms of how we find solutions to the problem that the country is grappling with and has been grappling with for so long. Does it mean that if there is changes to the unemployment rate, if there are changes to the high levels of violence generally in South Africa and criminality in South Africa, that this kind of behavior will cease to exist?
So let me start off by saying, as human beings, we all have prejudices that we all have stereotypes that we have, and some of these are unconscious and effortless. Having said that, these stereotypes and these attitudes that we have, these prejudices that we have, in most cases, they actually allow us to navigate social spaces. What interests me, or what I've put my time to do research on, is the connection between prejudices and these stereotypes, which are attitudes, and the actions, which now become xenophobia and racism in some cases, or black-on-black racism in some cases. So now to respond to your question in that regard, what can we do, right? There is a lot that we can do in terms of changing the narrative that we have been pervading already, in terms of how we talk about the language that we use when we talk about people, the discourse that we use when we refer to people coming from African countries, and in comparison to people who are coming from other countries. This does not change attitudes or the behaviors that people have, because it's not going to change. Sorry, it's not going to change the attitudes that people have, because it's not going to happen overnight, because it didn't start on one day. There is a lot of re-education that needs to happen within societies, and the media and politicians need to start speaking out and speaking positively about the way that we see Africans, change the narrative of how we perceive Africans and black skin specifically. But also there needs to be an active readdressing of every economical and social things. There are a lot of social traumas that black people, specifically in South Africa, experienced and still experience within South African spaces, and there's a lot of there's a lot of issues regarding access that continues to pervade these social traumas and economical traumas, and we are not actively addressing them. Of course, this is not going to end xenophobia in one day, or it's not going to end Aphrophobia in one day, as these are attitudes that like I said, that turn into actions or discriminatory actions. But this goes a long way into getting people from this unequal phase, where they actually view their neighbor as a scapegoat, who is maybe who they are perceiving as taking their opportunities from them. The moment we take away that inequality, or we increase those opportunities, I think there is a lot that can happen in terms of changing this behavior, or at least removing the violence that we are currently seeing in the current climate.
All right, Ivan, that's why I'm going to leave it with you, who is joining us from our Cape Town studios. Let me pick up here in studio. Sarah, he raises the issue of language, and language is important, but you're also talking to a country where language itself is such a complex issue, even when it comes to the 11, 12 official languages that we have in the country.
In fact, language is power, and language is an institution on itself that can be used to promote inclusion or exclusion or discrimination. In fact, in 2015, when the xenophobia attacks resurfaced again, we were asked by the Department of Basic Education to design an anti-xenophobia social equity program for learners in schools. And one of the questions we asked when we did the pilot from learners was that, where did you learn to discriminate another person on the basis of the place of origin, where they come from? Said, no, I didn't know earlier until my mom told me about this, or told me that this person is white. Then I sort of thought, what white do you mean? White like a paper or milk? So we, as Ivan is saying, we can unlearn. And for the children, it's very important. It can be immediate. But for the elders who have been exposed to this type of language, which was structurally from the past and carried on to the present, is where we need to do much work. You know? But for the young ones, if we institutionalize human rights education with a non-discriminatory language using the existing constitution and other plethora of legislation that we have, we can achieve what we're looking for. And then secondly, on the issue of the socioeconomic inequalities in the country and then the violence, it has really affected us as the foundation. In fact, we have recently just launched, if you talk about the language, that to educate is power. So we've launched a simpler version of the Constitution using animations, cartoons, 20 series, 20 sort of episodes which are in 4 languages, isiZulu, isiZulu, Sotho, and English and Afrikaans. And of course, we're continuing with the translations so that everyone, through using their language, they can access. But it's not only for the learners in schools, also for community radio stations, and it's available also on a website, which is accessible in all the 4 languages.
That is absolutely fantastic, because the Constitution is something that we need to make more accessible to everybody who is in this country. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so I'll have to wrap it up there. We're going to take a short break. Mark Lewis has your full sport update after this. Do stay with us.